In the autumn of 1783, the soldiers of the Continental Army began their long journey home. The war was over. Against all odds, the unlikeliest of revolutions had succeeded. 13 disparate colonies had stared down the mightiest military empire on earth and had won their freedom. The air buzzed with a new, intoxicating idea: the United States of America. For the men who had endured the frozen hell of Valley Forge, the bloody chaos of Bunker Hill, and the triumphant mud of Yorktown, the return was supposed to be a hero's welcome to a promised land. Among these returning veterans was Captain Daniel Shays of Western Massachusetts. Shays was not a man born to lead revolutions. He was a farm laborer before the war, a man of the soil, sturdy, quiet, and respected by his neighbors for his integrity rather than his ambition. When the call to arms came in 1775, he answered without hesitation. He fought with distinction, rising through the ranks on merit. He was wounded in action and cited for his bravery. At the end of his service, the Marquis de Lafayette, the celebrated French hero of the American cause, personally presented him with a magnificent, ornate sword as a mark of esteem. But when Shays returned home to the rolling hills of the Pelham Township, he found that the sword from Lafayette was one of the few things of value he owned. He, like thousands of his fellow soldiers, had been paid for years of brutal service in worthless paper currency, Continentals, that had depreciated so badly it was little more than a joke. He came home not to prosperity, but to a mountain of debt and taxes that had accumulated in his absence. This was the great bitter irony that awaited the victorious soldiers of the Revolution. They had fought a war against a distant king for imposing unjust taxes and denying them representation. Now they found themselves crushed by a new government, their own, that was levying taxes far more ruinous than any that the British had ever conceived. The source of the crisis was a toxic brew of post-war debt and class division. The new state government in Massachusetts, seated in the bustling port city of Boston, was dominated by a wealthy elite of merchants, shippers, and speculators. These men had largely financed the war, buying up war bonds at deeply discounted prices. Now they controlled the legislature, and they passed laws to ensure their investments would be repaid in full, not with the worthless paper money held by the common man, but in hard coin, gold and silver coin, known as specie. For the farmers of western Massachusetts, this was a death sentence. Their wealth was not in coin, but in land, livestock, and the promise of the next harvest. They lived in a barter economy, trading goods and services with their neighbors. Specie was almost non-existent. Yet the tax collectors, dispatched from Boston, arrived demanding hard coin. When the farmers couldn't pay, the merchants and lawyers who held their debts took them to court. The courts, which were supposed to be pillars of justice, became instruments of ruin. Day after day, they churned out judgments against the farmers. Men who had left their plows to fight for liberty now watched their plows be seized and sold at auction for a fraction of their value. Their cattle were taken, then their tools, and finally the very land their families had worked for generations. For those left with nothing, the final humiliation awaited. Debtor's prison, a squalid, disease-ridden institution where a man could languish for years over a debt of a few shillings. The betrayal felt visceral, personal, and profound. These veterans looked at their foreclosure notices and saw a declaration of war more insidious than any issued by King George III. They had fought to create a republic of freeholders, a nation of independent yeoman farmers. Instead, they were being systematically dispossessed and turned into a landless peasantry, ruled by a new aristocracy of wealth based in Boston. The government they had bled for was now bleeding them dry. Initially, they followed the path of civic duty. They did what good Republicans were supposed to do. They organized. They held town meetings and county conventions. They drafted petitions, carefully worded documents that laid out their grievances with heartbreaking clarity. They begged the legislature in Boston for relief. They asked for the issuance of paper money. They pleaded for tender laws that would allow them to pay their debts with farm goods instead of scarce coin. They implored the government to remember their service, their sacrifice. Their pleas fell on deaf ears. The Boston elite saw the farmers not as struggling patriots, but as lazy, profligate debtors trying to shirk their obligations. Samuel Adams, once the firebrand of the Revolution, who had railed against British tyranny, was now a powerful state senator. He dismissed the farmers' petitions with contempt, declaring that rebellion against a monarchy was a sacred duty, but rebellion against a republic was treason, punishable by death. The government, deaf to their pleas, responded by raising taxes even higher to pay its wealthy creditors more quickly. By the summer of 1786, the farmers of western Massachusetts reached a breaking point. The system had failed them. The peaceful political process was a sham. The law itself had become their enemy. If the courts were the mechanism of their destruction, they reasoned, then the courts must be stopped. The time of petitions was over. The time for action had come. And they turned to the one man they trusted to lead them, the quiet, reluctant hero with Lafayette's sword hanging on his wall. Part 2. The closing of the courts. Daniel Shays did not seek leadership. It was thrust upon him. He, like his neighbors, was drowning in debt. He had already been forced to sell the ceremonial sword from Lafayette, a painful symbol of the chasm between the Revolution's promise and its reality. When his fellow farmers approached him, they saw not a radical firebrand, but a man of their own kind who possessed something they desperately needed: military experience and a reputation for steady command. He was a symbol of their shared sacrifice. Reluctantly, Shays agreed. A new army began to form in the hills of western Massachusetts. It was an army of ghosts from the Revolution. These were not an unruly mob of rioters. They were disciplined veterans. They marched in formation. They followed orders, and they understood strategy. They called themselves regulators, a name with deep historical resonance, hearkening back to earlier movements against corrupt, distant authorities. Their goal was not to overthrow the government, but to regulate its abuses. Their immediate objective was clear: to shut down the civil courts and stop the legal process of foreclosure and imprisonment. In late August 1786, the first major action took place. A force of nearly 1,500 regulators, with Shays among their leaders, marched on the county courthouse in Northampton. They were armed not with muskets, but with staves and clubs and an unshakable sense of righteous anger. They formed a disciplined cordon around the courthouse, preventing the judges and lawyers from entering. When a government militia was called out to confront them, many of the militiamen, themselves farmers, sympathetic to the cause, refused to act. Some even switched sides and joined the regulators. The court, unable to convene, adjourned. It was a stunning, bloodless victory. The success at Northampton electrified the region. The movement spread like wildfire. In Worcester, Concord, and Great Barrington, similar scenes played out. Thousands of farmers, calling themselves Shaysmen or Shaysites, rose up and closed the courts. They were in effect suspending the authority of the Boston government in the western half of the state. In Boston, the government's response was a mixture of panic and fury. Governor Bowdoin, a wealthy merchant and one of the state's largest creditors, saw the uprising not as a desperate protest, but as an act of treasonous anarchy. He refused to negotiate. He condemned the farmers as enemies of the Republic, a rabble threatening to undo the very foundations of the new nation. The state government found itself in a precarious position. The national government, operating under the weak and ineffective Articles of Confederation, was powerless. It had no army and no authority to intervene in a state matter. Governor Bowdoin had to act on his own. He tried to call up the state militia, but found it unreliable, riddled with sympathy for the rebels. Forced into a corner, Bowdoin and the wealthy Boston elite took an extraordinary step. They created their own army. They passed the hat among 130 of Boston's richest merchants, raising a private fund of over £6,000 to hire and equip a force of 3,000 mercenary soldiers. To command this new army, they chose General Lincoln, another respected veteran of the Revolutionary War. The stage was now set for a tragedy of epic proportions. It would be a civil war in miniature. On one side stood Daniel Shays, leading an army of veteran farmers who felt betrayed by the nation they had created. On the other stood General Lincoln, leading a private army of mercenaries funded by the wealthy elite to enforce the very policies the farmers were protesting. The revolution was about to devour its own children. Two men who had fought side by side for American liberty were now destined to face each other on the battlefield as enemies. The cold Massachusetts winter of 1787 was about to turn bloody. As winter tightened its grip on New England, the situation escalated toward a final, decisive confrontation. The regulators, led by Shays, knew that their army of staves and pitchforks was no match for the well-equipped force being raised by General Lincoln. If they were to have any hope of defending themselves and forcing the government to negotiate, they needed weapons. Their gaze turned to one critical location: the United States Arsenal in Springfield. The Springfield Arsenal was a federal facility, one of the main storehouses for the muskets, cannons, and gunpowder of the former Continental Army. For the rebels, it was a treasure trove, the key to leveling the playing field. For the government, it represented a symbolic red line. An attack on a federal arsenal was no longer a protest against state policy. It was an act of open insurrection against the United States itself. Shays devised a plan for a three-pronged attack. He would lead one column of men, while two other regulator leaders, Luke Day and Eli Parsons, would lead two other columns. They would converge on the arsenal simultaneously in late January 1787. But the plan began to unravel almost immediately. The winter was brutal, with deep snow and punishing cold. Communication between the rebel columns was poor. Luke Day, whose force was crucial to the plan, sent a message to Shays stating that he would not be ready to attack on the agreed-upon date of January 25th. That message, however, was intercepted by the government forces. Shays, unaware that his reinforcements would not be coming, marched forward, his army of 1,200 ill-equipped farmers trudging through the snow towards Springfield. Waiting for them at the arsenal was a force of 1,200 state militia under the command of General William Shepard, another veteran of the Revolution. Shepard was determined to hold the arsenal at all costs. He positioned his men and his cannons on the hill where the armory stood, overlooking the road upon which the rebels would advance. On the frigid afternoon of January 25th, Shays and his men emerged from the woods. They advanced steadily up the hill, their ranks surprisingly orderly. They were still operating under the belief that their former comrades-in-arms would not fire upon them. They had shut down courts across the state without a single shot being fired in anger. They expected the militia to back down, as others had before. Shepard gave them a clear warning. He ordered 2 cannons to be fired over the heads of the advancing rebels. The roar of the artillery echoed through the frozen landscape. Still, the rebels pressed forward, convinced it was a bluff. Shepard, his face grim, gave the final, terrible order: fire. This time, the cannons were aimed directly into the center of the rebel column. They were loaded not with solid shot, but with grape shot. A canvas bag filled with dozens of small iron balls that turned the cannon into a giant shotgun. The effect was devastating. The blast ripped through the front ranks of the rebels, a whirlwind of metal that scythed through the air. Men screamed and fell, their bodies torn apart. 4 farmers were killed instantly, and 20 more were wounded. The psychological impact was even more profound than the physical one. The rebels were stunned into horrified disbelief. This was not a bluff. The government they had fought to install, the army in which they had served, was now using artillery to slaughter them in a snowy field. The ultimate betrayal had been made manifest in a cloud of cannon smoke and the cries of the dying. Panic routed them. The disciplined advance dissolved into a terrified scramble for safety. They broke ranks and fled, melting back into the woods, leaving their dead and wounded behind in the snow. The battle for the Springfield Arsenal, which had been the rebels' last hope, was over in minutes. The end came swiftly. General Lincoln's main army arrived a few days later.
He pursued Shays's scattered forces relentlessly through a blinding blizzard, finally surprising them at their camp in Petersham and dispersing the last remnants of the rebellion. The leaders, including Daniel Shays, fled the state, seeking refuge in the independent territory of Vermont. The government's crackdown was initially harsh. Hundreds of rebels were arrested. 14 of the leaders were tried and sentenced to death for treason. But a wave of popular sympathy and a fear of creating martyrs led to a more moderate response. Governor Bowdoin was voted out of office and replaced by the more popular John Hancock. In the end, only 2 men were hanged, and they for looting, not for rebellion. Daniel Shays and the other leaders were eventually pardoned in 1788. Militarily, Shays Rebellion was an abject failure, but its political consequences were monumental. This was the true and entirely unintended revenge of the betrayed farmers. The uprising sent a shockwave of terror through the national leadership. George Washington, in retirement at Vernon, wrote in alarm, "I am mortified beyond expression. We have probably had too good an opinion of human nature in forming our Confederation." The rebellion exposed the fatal weakness of the Articles of Confederation. The spectacle of a state government unable to control its own territory and a national government powerless to assist convinced leaders like James Madison and Alexander Hamilton that the Republic was on the verge of collapse. The fear engendered by Daniel Shays and his army of angry farmers was the single most important catalyst for the Constitutional Convention. In May 1787, just 4 months after the confrontation at Springfield, delegates from the states convened in Philadelphia. Their initial goal was to amend the Articles, but spurred by the specter of anarchy raised by Shays Rebellion, they scrapped them entirely and began drafting a new, much more powerful framework for the nation, the United States Constitution. Thus, the final legacy of the farmers' protest was not defeat, but a profound, systemic victory they never intended. Their armed revolt, born of a deep and personal sense of political and professional betrayal, failed on the battlefield, but succeeded in forcing the nation's founders to create a stronger, more stable federal government capable of managing national debt and ensuring domestic tranquility. Daniel Shays, the reluctant captain who lost the fight for his farm, had inadvertently helped forge a new and more durable republic. He died in obscurity, but his rebellion remains a crucial, cautionary tale in the American story, a testament to what happens when a nation breaks its promise to the very patriots who brought it into being.